February 14, 1946. Valentine's Day in America meant cards, chocolates, and celebrations of romance. But at Camp Crossville, Tennessee, a remote prisoner of war facility housing German women auxiliaries, the day carried a cruel irony that no one could have predicted. Lieutenant Colonel William Hammond stood in his office at precisely 7:30 the morning, holding a classified memo from the War Department, his weathered face reflecting confusion and concern. The document, dated February 11th, outlined standard repatriation procedures for the 43 German women still held at his facility. What made this particular morning extraordinary wasn't the orders themselves, but the 4 handwritten letters that had arrived on his desk on the evening of February 13th. 4 separate German prisoners, writing in careful English, had submitted formal requests to delay their repatriation. The reason they gave was unprecedented in the entire history of American military operations. They had fallen in love with their American guards. Among those 4 letters was one from Margarete Klein, a 4-year-old former Wehrmacht radio operator from Munich. Her letter, dated February 12th, was the most articulate, the most painfully honest, and the most troubling. Colonel Hammond read it again, searching for any hint of deception or manipulation. He found only raw vulnerability. She had written, "I know what I am asking is against all regulations and all reason. I know that I am the enemy and should wish only to return to my homeland. But in 15 months of captivity, I have discovered something I never expected to find. Corporal Thomas Bennett has shown me a kindness that I do not deserve and cannot forget. I do not ask to stay as a prisoner. I ask only for time to understand what has happened to my heart." The implications were staggering. Fraternization between guards and prisoners violated explicit military codes. If these relationships had developed to the point where women were requesting to delay repatriation, it suggested a complete breakdown of proper prisoner oversight. Yet Hammond had been commanding this facility since January 3, 1945, and he knew his guards. They were good men, professionals who had maintained appropriate boundaries. Or so he had believed. At 8:15 that morning, he summoned his executive officer, Captain Patricia Morrison, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the German women. She entered his office with the bearing of someone who already knew why she'd been called. "You've read the letters," Hammond said, not a question but a statement. Morrison nodded. "I have, sir. I received copies last night at 21 hours, and I've been expecting something like this for months." Her admission hung in the air between them. She had known. She had watched these relationships developing and had said nothing. Before Hammond could respond, she continued, "Sir, these aren't cases of prisoners manipulating guards or guards abusing their authority. I've observed the interactions carefully. What's happened here is something more complicated, more human than our regulations anticipated." She paused, choosing her words precisely. "These women have been in our custody for over a year. They've worked alongside our soldiers, shared meals, celebrated holidays, grieved over news from their destroyed homeland. They've gone through a complete psychological transformation, rejecting everything they once believed about Americans and about themselves. And yes, sir, some of them have fallen in love." The story had begun 15 months earlier, on the cold morning of November 12, 1944, when 3 transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Crossville at approximately 9:45, carrying the first group of German women prisoners to arrive at the newly converted facility. The camp had originally housed Italian POWs, but with Italy's surrender on September 8, 1943, and shift to co-belligerent status, the compound had been repurposed for this unusual assignment. Among the 38 women who stepped off those trucks was Margarete Klein, her dark blonde hair pulled back severely, her gray auxiliary uniform still bearing the insignia she'd worn while serving as a communications specialist for Wehrmacht forces in France. She carried herself with rigid military posture, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. She had been captured on September 17, 1944, during the Allied push through eastern France. surrendered along with her entire communications unit when their position became surrounded near the village of Epinal. The American soldiers who had taken her prisoner had treated her correctly, if coldly. She had expected worse. Corporal Thomas Bennett, 26, a farm boy from rural Kentucky with sandy brown hair and an easy smile, was among the guards assigned to process the new arrivals. He had volunteered for this duty partly out of curiosity. He'd spent 2 years guarding German and Italian male prisoners at various camps across the South, but he'd never encountered female POWs before. He wasn't sure what to expect. His first glimpse of Margarete came at 10:30 that morning as she stood in the processing line, her face a carefully maintained mask of composure. When their eyes met briefly, he saw something that surprised him, not hatred or even fear, but profound sadness. She looked like someone who had lost everything and was simply going through the motions of survival. The processing took hours, finally concluding at 16:45. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. Their few personal belongings were catalogued. Margarete had almost nothing: a small leather satchel containing a change of clothes, a prayer book, and a single photograph of a young man in Wehrmacht uniform who Bennett would later learn was her brother, Karl, killed at Stalingrad on January 31, 1943. When Bennett handed back her belongings after inspection, their hands touched briefly. Margarete flinched and pulled back as if burned, her composure cracking for just an instant. Bennett saw tears forming in her eyes before she blinked them away. "Es tut mir leid," she whispered in German, an automatic apology. Bennett didn't speak German, but he understood the tone. "It's okay," he said gently, gesturing that she could take her things. Something in his voice made her look at him again, this time with confusion. His expression wasn't hostile. If anything, he looked sympathetic. The first weeks established rigid routines. The German women were housed in Barracks C, a separate building surrounded by fencing that kept them isolated from other areas of the camp. They were assigned work duties in the kitchens, laundry, and administrative offices starting November 20th. Margarete, with her technical background, was put to work in the camp's communication center, sorting and filing under strict supervision. Bennett was not her direct guard, but he worked the evening shift at the main gate from 18 to 2, which meant he saw the women returning from their work details each day. He began to notice patterns. Margarete always walked with perfect posture, never speaking to the other women unless necessary. She seemed isolated even among her fellow prisoners. On the evening of December 3, 1944, as temperatures dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and the first snow began to fall, Bennett noticed Margarete shivering violently as she walked back from her duty assignment at 17:45. The Tennessee winter of 1944 proved harsher than anyone anticipated. By December 10th, temperatures had plunged to 19 degrees, and the barracks housing the German women, hastily converted from previous use, were poorly insulated. Margarete developed a persistent cough that she tried desperately to hide during morning roll calls at 6:30, knowing that showing weakness could mean isolation in the camp infirmary. Bennett noticed anyway. He had been raised to notice when living things were suffering, whether crops struggling in drought or animals showing signs of illness. His grandmother had taught him that ignoring suffering when you had the power to ease it was a sin, regardless of whether the suffering belonged to friend or stranger. On the evening of December 5th, after seeing Margarete shivering, he made a decision that would alter both their lives. On December 6th at 14:30, he approached Captain Morrison and requested permission to distribute additional blankets to the women's barracks, citing concerns about prisoners becoming ill and creating health risks for the entire camp. Morrison, who had been wrestling with the same concerns, approved the request at 15. When Bennett delivered the blankets on the evening of December 7th at 19:30, he found Margarete in the barracks common area, attempting to read an American newspaper with a German-English dictionary. She looked up as he entered, instinctively standing at attention as she'd been trained. "At ease," Bennett said, using one of the few German phrases he'd picked up. "Ruhen." He held out a heavy wool blanket. "For you. For the cold." Margarete stared at the blanket as if it were something dangerous. Accepting kindness from the enemy felt like a betrayal, yet she was so cold that her fingers had gone numb. Slowly, she reached out and took it. "Danke," she whispered, then added in halting English, "Thank you." Bennett noticed the newspaper and dictionary. "You're learning English?" Margarete nodded, embarrassed to be caught attempting something that might seem presumptuous. "I try. Is difficult." "Your English is better than my German," Bennett said with a smile. Then, on impulse, he gestured to the newspaper. "If you want help, I could. I mean, if it's allowed, I could explain some of the words during my evening rounds." The offer hung between them, loaded with implications neither fully understood. Margarete knew she should refuse, should maintain the distance appropriate between prisoner and captor. But the loneliness of the past months had been crushing, and the opportunity to actually communicate with someone, to engage her mind beyond the simple repetitive tasks of daily work, was desperately appealing. "I would like this," she said carefully, "if is permitted." That night at 21:45, Captain Morrison noted in her daily log that Corporal Bennett had requested permission to provide English tutoring to interested German prisoners, citing the practical benefits of improved communication. She approved the request on December 8 at 8, seeing it as a positive development that might ease tensions and improve camp operations. What began as practical language lessons evolved into something more complex. Starting December 11th, 3 evenings a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 19:30, Bennett would spend 30 minutes at the fence line near the women's barracks, helping Margarete and 2 other women practice English. They would work through newspaper articles, Bennett explaining idioms and context, while the women struggled with pronunciation. But inevitably, language lessons became conversations. By December 22nd, Margarete had learned that Bennett had grown up on a tobacco farm outside Bowling Green, that he had 4 younger sisters, that he'd been engaged before the war. But his fiancée had married someone else on June 4, 1943, when he'd been deployed overseas. She was surprised by his openness, his willingness to share personal details with someone who was supposed to be his enemy. Spring arrived in Tennessee with an explosion of dogwood blossoms, and by April 10, 1945, warm breezes made the camp feel less like a prison and more like an ordinary place where ordinary lives might be possible. But April 15, 1945, brought news that shattered any illusion of normalcy. American and British forces advancing through Germany had begun liberating concentration camps, and the first reports of what they found were filtering back to the United States. On that morning, photographs appeared in newspapers and newsreels, images of skeletal figures behind wire, of mass graves, of horrors so systematic and complete that they defied comprehension. At Camp Crossville, Captain Morrison made the difficult decision on April 16 at 9 to allow the German women access to these reports. She believed they had a right to know and a responsibility to confront what had been done in their country's name. On the afternoon of April 16 at 14:30, Margarete sat in the barracks common room, staring at photographs from Buchenwald, liberated on April 11, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, liberated on April 15. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the newspaper. Other women gathered around, reading in stunned silence. Some began to weep, others sat in numb shock. One woman vomited and had to be helped outside. "This cannot be real," someone whispered in German. "This is propaganda." But Margarete knew better. The images were too detailed, too horrible to be fabricated. More damning, they explained things she had tried not to notice during her service, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Euphemistic references to resettlement and special treatment, the disappearance of Jewish neighbors from her street in Munich, one family at a time. The Rosenbaum family had vanished on November 3, 1942, the Goldsteins on March 12, 1943. She had told herself she didn't know, that it wasn't her business, that surely the rumors couldn't be true. Now she understood that her ignorance had been a choice, a comfortable lie she'd told herself, because knowing would have required action she wasn't brave enough to take. That evening at 20:15, Bennett found her sitting alone behind the barracks, her face buried in her hands. He knew he should maintain proper distance, but seeing her devastation overrode his training. "Margarete," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "How can I be the same person who served that country?" she asked in English that had improved dramatically over the months. "How can I have believed we were defending something honorable when we were defending that?" Bennett sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance but close enough that his presence offered comfort. "You didn't know," he said. "That doesn't make you responsible for what others did." "But I should have known," she insisted. "There were signs. Things we chose not to see because seeing would have been inconvenient, dangerous. I chose comfort over courage, Thomas. I chose not to ask questions." It was the first time she had used his first name. The intimacy of the moment felt both entirely natural and completely forbidden. They sat in silence as the sun set at 1947, both aware they were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Finally, Bennett spoke. "My grandmother used to say that what matters isn't where you've been or what you've done in ignorance. What matters is what you do once you know the truth." Margarete turned to look at him, searching his face. "Why are you kind to me, after everything? After knowing what my country did?" Bennett met her eyes. "Because you're not your country. You're a person who made mistakes, like we all do. And because," he hesitated, then continued, "because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as the enemy and started seeing you as just Margarete." May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought celebration across America, but at Camp Crossville, the mood was complicated. At 9 that morning, news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the camp. For the German women, their country's surrender meant the final collapse of everything they had once believed in. Margarete stood at the window of the barracks watching American guards celebrate, feeling utterly disconnected from both sides of the conflict. She was no longer German in the way she had been, but she certainly wasn't American. She existed in a strange liminal space, belonging nowhere. The weeks following VE Day brought unsettling news from Germany. The country had been divided into occupation zones. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, homeless, starving. The women at Camp Crossville began receiving their first letters from home, brought through Red Cross channels. The news was universally devastating. Margarete's letter arrived on May 28, 1945. Her mother was alive but living in a basement in what remained of their Munich neighborhood in the Schwabing district. Her father, Ernst Klein, had died during an Allied bombing raid on February 25, 1945. Her two younger sisters, Greta and Hanna, were missing, last seen fleeing toward the countryside on April 28 when Russian forces approached from the east. The letter was written in her mother's shaking handwriting, barely legible, dated May 10. It ended with a simple plea, "Come home, Margarete. There is nothing left here, but I need you." Margarete read the letter 3 times on the afternoon of May 28, then carefully folded it and placed it in her prayer book. That evening at 19:30, she couldn't bring herself to go to the English lesson with Bennett. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, paralyzed by competing obligations. Her mother needed her. Her country, broken and devastated, needed everyone who could contribute to rebuilding. Yet the thought of leaving Camp Crossville, of leaving the life she'd built here, of leaving Thomas Bennett, filled her with a grief so profound she could barely breathe. Bennett noticed her absence immediately. After the lesson ended at 20 and the other women returned to their barracks, he approached Captain Morrison at 20:15. "Permission to check on prisoner Klein, ma'am. She's never missed a lesson before." Morrison studied him carefully. She had watched the growing connection between Bennett and Margarete for months, noting how his face lit up when he saw her, how she smiled in his presence in a way she never did otherwise. She had documented nothing, violating her own duty to report fraternization, because what she had observed seemed genuine and mutual, a small human miracle emerging from the cruelty of war. "5 minutes, Corporal," she said. "And Bennett? Be careful." He found Margarete at 20:20 sitting outside the barracks in the gathering dusk. When she heard his footsteps, she quickly wiped her eyes, but he had already seen the tears. "Your letter came," he said, sitting beside her on the bench. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. Bennett waited, giving her time. Finally, she pulled out the letter and handed it to him. He read it slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each line. When he finished, he carefully folded it and returned it to her. "You'll go back," he said quietly. "Of course you will. She's your mother. Your family needs you." Margarete turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "And what if I don't want to go?" The words hung between them, dangerous and true. Bennett's breath caught. "Margarete, I know it is wrong," she continued, speaking rapidly now as if afraid she'd lose courage if she stopped. "I know that I am prisoner and you are guard and we should not even be having this conversation. But Thomas, in this place I have found something I never had in Germany. I have found someone who sees me, truly sees who I am, not as a tool for the state or a symbol of anything, but just as myself." The morning of May 29, 1945, Bennett reported for duty at 6 with dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept, had instead spent the entire night wrestling with the implications of what had transpired between them. Military regulations were explicit. Fraternization with enemy prisoners was strictly forbidden and could result in court-martial. More than that, he questioned his own motives and judgment. Was he taking advantage of someone vulnerable, someone whose freedom depended on the goodwill of her captors? But when he honestly examined his feelings, he knew the truth was more complicated. Over the months of conversation, he had watched Margarete transform from a rigid, defensive prisoner into someone vibrant and curious, someone whose intelligence and dry humor he genuinely enjoyed. He looked forward to their evening lessons with an anticipation that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the simple joy of her company. He was in love with her. The realization should have filled him with alarm, but instead it felt like finally acknowledging something that had been obvious for months. The question was, what to do about it? That afternoon at 14:30 on May 29th, Lieutenant Colonel Hammond summoned Bennett to his office. The colonel sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Corporal Bennett, I've received a report from one of the other guards. Sergeant Collins filed this report at 8 this morning, expressing concern about your interactions with prisoner Klein. He suggests that your relationship has exceeded appropriate boundaries." Bennett's stomach dropped, but he stood at attention. "Sir, Hammond raised a hand. "I'm not looking for excuses or denials, Corporal. I'm looking for the truth. Have you developed a personal attachment to this prisoner?" The direct question left no room for evasion. Bennett met his commanding officer's eyes. "Yes, sir. I have." "And has she reciprocated these feelings?" "I believe so, sir." Hammond leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Do you understand that under normal circumstances, I would be obligated to bring you up on charges? That fraternization with enemy prisoners is a serious violation of military code?" "I understand, sir." "Do you also understand that this puts both you and prisoner Klein in an impossible position? That even if your feelings are genuine, acting on them while she's in custody would be fundamentally coercive? She's not free to reject your advances, Bennett. That makes any relationship between you inherently problematic." The words struck Bennett like a physical blow because they articulated something he had been trying not to confront. Could Margarete's feelings be genuine when she was a prisoner and he was her guard? Did the power imbalance make their entire connection suspect? Hammond saw the impact of his words and softened slightly. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Corporal. I'm trying to make you think clearly about a situation that could destroy both your career and her future prospects." He paused. "That said, I've observed prisoner Klein myself. Captain Morrison has as well. We both believe her transformation is genuine, and we've both noticed the change in her demeanor around you. So I'm going to handle this differently than regulations require." Bennett waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Effective June 1st, 1945, I'm removing you from guard duty," Hammond continued. "You'll be reassigned to administrative work in a different section of the camp where you'll have no direct contact with the German prisoners. This accomplishes two things. It removes the immediate ethical problem of a guard fraternizing with someone in his custody, and it tests whether these feelings survive separation and distance. Bennett felt simultaneously relieved and devastated. "And Margarete Prisoner Klein, sir? She'll be informed on June 1st that you've been reassigned and that further contact between you is prohibited. If, after she's repatriated and you're no longer in a position of authority over her, you wish to correspond or pursue a relationship, that's your business. But while she remains a prisoner, there will be no contact." The separation was harder than either Bennett or Margarete had anticipated. For 3 months, from June 1st through August 31st, 1945, they lived in the same camp but occupied completely different worlds. Bennett worked in the administrative building, processing paperwork for the gradual repatriation of prisoners from camps across the region. Margarete continued her duties in the communications center, now working under the supervision of Captain Morrison. They sometimes saw each other at a distance across the compound, but any attempt at communication would have risked Bennett's career and Margarete's standing. Captain Morrison, who had become something of an unofficial confidant to Margarete, tried to help her process the situation during their weekly check-ins every Thursday at 15. On June 7th, she told Margarete, "I know this feels like punishment, but Colonel Hammond is actually trying to protect both of you." "Protect us from what?" Margarete asked, her voice bitter. "From our own feelings? From the appearance of coercion," Morrison explained gently. "As long as you're a prisoner and he's your guard, any relationship between you exists under fundamentally unequal circumstances. Thomas can't offer you freedom, but he has power over your daily life. That makes it impossible to know if your feelings are genuine or survival instinct." The words echoed what Margarete had been asking herself in the dark hours of the night. She had fallen in love with Thomas, or at least she believed she had. But would she have developed these feelings if she'd met him as a free woman in ordinary circumstances? Or was she simply attaching herself to kindness because she was vulnerable and alone? During those months, the population at Camp Crossville gradually decreased as male German prisoners were repatriated through various channels. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, bringing final victory but also raising questions about what would happen to the remaining German women. On September 18, 1945, Margarete received a second letter from her mother, dated August 30th. The tone was more desperate than the first. Her mother had found Margarete's younger sister Greta on August 12th, alive but traumatized after being assaulted by Russian soldiers on May 2nd. They were living in a single room, sharing it with 2 other families. Food was scarce. The occupation authorities provided minimal support. "We need you, Greta especially," her mother wrote. "She asks for you every day. Please come home." Margarete carried the letter with her constantly, reading it until the paper grew soft from handling. The guilt of being relatively safe and fed while her family suffered was crushing. Yet the thought of returning to Germany without resolving what had happened with Thomas felt equally unbearable. In November, rumors began circulating about imminent repatriation for the women. Then, on February 11, 1946, the official announcement came. Colonel Hammond assembled all 43 remaining German women in the camp's main hall at 10. "Ladies," he began, "I have received orders from the War Department dated February 8, 1946. All German female prisoners of war are to be repatriated within the next 8 weeks. You will be transported to New York on March 28, where you'll board ships to Bremen. From there, you'll be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to your homes." He paused, observing the mixture of relief and anxiety on their faces. "I want you to know that during your time at Camp Crossville, you have conducted yourselves with dignity. You've worked hard, learned English, and shown genuine remorse for your country's actions. You go home with our respect." That evening at 21, Margarete sat with 3 other women who had become her closest friends. Anna Weber, who had worked in the camp hospital, Greta Hoffman, who had discovered a talent for mechanical repairs, and Maria Gotch, who had served as an administrative assistant. They had all noticed the same thing. Each of them had developed close relationships with specific American guards. The four women sat in the barracks common room at 22:30 on February 11th, long after lights out, speaking in hushed German. Their conversation circled around a question none of them wanted to voice directly: what were they willing to sacrifice for love? Anna spoke first. "Dieter has asked me to write to him after I return to Germany," she said, referring to Sergeant Dieter Müller, a German-American guard whose grandparents had immigrated in 1907. "He says he'll try to visit when he gets leave. But we both know that's a fantasy. I'll be in Germany trying to rebuild my life, and he'll be here. The distance, the cost, the difficulty, it will fade." Greta nodded. "Klaus told me the same thing yesterday at 16. He said we should see what happens after the war, but I can read between the lines. He's being kind, letting me down gently. Once I'm gone, we'll exchange a few letters maybe, and then life will move on." Maria, typically the most practical of the group, looked at Margarete. "And you? What about Corporal Bennett?" Margarete had been dreading this question. "I don't know. We haven't spoken since June 1st. For all I know, he's forgotten about me, realized the whole thing was a mistake brought on by unusual circumstances." "Do you believe that?" Anna asked gently. "No," Margarete admitted. "I see how he looks at me when he thinks no one is watching. But even if his feelings haven't changed, what difference does it make? I have to go home. My mother and sister need me. And Thomas has his life here, his career, his family. What am I supposed to do? Ask him to throw all that away for a German woman he talked to across a fence for a few months?" The bleakness in her voice reflected the impossibility they all felt. Wartime had created these connections, but peacetime would tear them apart. Geography, regulation, social pressure, and simple logistics stood against any of these relationships surviving. Yet the following morning, at 9 on February 12th, something unexpected happened. Margarete requested a meeting with Colonel Hammond and Captain Morrison. When she was escorted into the colonel's office at 10:30, she carried a handwritten letter and wore an expression of determined resignation. "Colonel, Captain," she began in her now fluent English, "I have a request that I know is highly unusual. I wish to delay my repatriation." Hammond exchanged glances with Morrison. "On what grounds, Klein?" "On the grounds that—" She paused, then forced herself to continue with absolute honesty. "On the grounds that I have fallen in love with Corporal Thomas Bennett, and I cannot return to Germany without knowing if there might be a future for us." The directness of her statement left both officers momentarily speechless. Finally, Morrison spoke. "Margarete, you understand that even if we could delay your repatriation, it doesn't change the fundamental problems. You're still an enemy national. Thomas is still an American soldier. The regulations haven't changed." "I understand," Margarete said, "but what I'm asking for is time. Time for us to determine if what we feel is real, or if it's just a wartime illusion that will fade when normal life resumes. Time for me to become something other than a prisoner, so that if Thomas chooses me, it's because he wants to, not because of some misplaced sense of obligation or sympathy." She placed the letter on Hammond's desk. "This is from my mother, dated August 30th, 1945, begging me to come home. If I delay repatriation, I'm choosing to let my family suffer longer without my help. I don't make this request lightly, but I need to know if there's any possibility that what Thomas and I found together has a future." Colonel Hammond's decision took 2 weeks, finally arriving on February 26, 1946. During that time, news spread through the camp about Margarete's request. To everyone's surprise, on February 15th, 16th, and 18th, 3 other women came forward with similar petitions. Anna, Greta, and Maria had each fallen in love with guards and were requesting delays to explore whether these relationships could survive beyond the artificial environment of captivity. The requests created a minor scandal that reached all the way to the War Department in Washington. Military officials debated the precedent it would set, the potential for abuse, and the diplomatic complications of German nationals requesting to remain in the United States for romantic reasons. Meanwhile, the men involved faced their own reckonings. On February 20th, 1946, Bennett was called before a review board at 14. to explain his relationship with Margarete and to confirm that he had maintained appropriate boundaries during her captivity. His testimony was straightforward and honest, which both helped and complicated matters. He made no excuses, acknowledged his feelings openly, and accepted responsibility for any violations of protocol. Sergeant Collins, who had initially reported Bennett's conduct, testified at 15:30 that he had never witnessed any physical contact or explicitly inappropriate behavior, only excessive friendliness and familiarity that made him uncomfortable. Captain Morrison's testimony at 16 proved crucial. She described observing the relationship develop over months, noting that Margarete's English lessons had been officially approved on December 8, 1944, and that the growing connection between her and Bennett had been evident to supervisory staff. "I monitored the situation closely," she told the board. "At no point did I observe Corporal Bennett using his position to coerce or manipulate prisoner Klein. What I observed was two people discovering mutual respect and affection under highly unusual circumstances. I chose not to intervene because I believed their connection was genuine and, frankly, harmless." The review board's decision, delivered on February 25 at 11, was cautious but unexpectedly sympathetic. Bennett would receive an official reprimand for allowing personal feelings to compromise his professional judgment, but no criminal charges would be filed. He would be honorably discharged from service on April 15, 1946, earlier than originally scheduled, effectively ending his military career. When Bennett was informed of the decision at 13 on February 25, his first question was about Margarete. "What happens to her?" The answer came directly from Washington on February 26. The four women who had requested delayed repatriation would be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons, effective March 1, 1946. They would be released from military custody but would need to find sponsors, housing, and employment. If they could demonstrate self-sufficiency and obtain the necessary paperwork, they could apply for immigration status. It was, essentially, a test. Could these relationships survive when both parties were free? Could the women build independent lives in America? Could the couples withstand the social pressure and logistical challenges of forming families across enemy lines? For Anna and Greta, the answer became clear almost immediately. When released from custody on March 1 and faced with the reality of finding work and housing in a country still hostile to Germans, when their American lovers were transferred to other posts on March 15 and March 22 respectively, and distance created silence, their courage faltered. On March 25, both women decided to accept repatriation, parting from their American boyfriends with tearful goodbyes and promises to write that both sides knew would fade. Maria's story ended differently, but no less painfully. She secured sponsorship from a local church on March 3 and found work in a textile factory on March 18. For 3 months, she and her American lieutenant maintained their relationship, meeting for supervised visits and making plans. Then, on June 10, he received orders deploying him to occupied Japan. The distance and indefinite separation proved too much. On June 20, they agreed to part as friends, acknowledging that timing and circumstances were against them, which left only Margarete and Thomas Bennett. When Margarete was officially released from prisoner status at 9 on March 1, 1946, she walked out of Camp Crossville, carrying the same small leather satchel she had arrived with on November 12, 1944, 17 months earlier. But everything else about her had changed. The Henderson family, the same family who had sponsored Ingrid in the competitor's story, had agreed to sponsor Margarete as well, having met her through church outreach. Mrs. Henderson picked her up at 10:30 inches, her aging Ford, chattering nervously about the room they'd prepared and the possible job opportunities in town. Margarete listened politely, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Thomas had been discharged on April 15, 1946, and had returned to Kentucky to help his family with spring planting. They had agreed to write to each other, to take time apart to determine if their feelings survived outside the artificial pressure of the camp environment. But 3 weeks of separation had only intensified Margarete's certainty. She loved him. Not because he had been kind when others were cruel, not because he represented safety or opportunity, but because of who he was: patient, thoughtful, principled, and deeply good. On April 12, 1946, at 14:30, exactly 1 year after President Roosevelt's death, Thomas Bennett appeared on the Hendersons' front porch. He wore civilian clothes, work pants, and a simple button-down shirt, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that he'd clearly picked himself. Margarete saw him from the window and felt her heart stop. She walked out slowly at 14:35, aware that Mrs. Henderson was watching from behind the curtains with barely concealed excitement. "Hi," Thomas said, suddenly awkward in a way he never had been during their fence-line conversations. "I know we said we'd take time, but I couldn't. I had to see you." Margarete smiled. "I'm glad you came." They sat on the porch swing, maintaining a careful distance that felt absurd after everything they'd been through. "I've been thinking," Thomas began, then stopped. "Actually, I haven't been able to think about anything else. Margarete, I know this is complicated. I know my family won't understand at first, that people in town will talk, that there are 1,000 practical reasons why this shouldn't work." He turned to face her fully. "But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to fight for it." Margarete felt tears forming. "Your career, your family. My career was the army, and that's done," he interrupted gently. "My family will come around once they meet you. And the rest of it, the gossip, the difficulties, we'll face them together, if you want to." "What are you asking me?" Margarete whispered, though she already knew. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to build a life with me, here in America or wherever we need to go. I'm asking you to take a chance on something that started in the strangest possible way but feels more real than anything I've ever known." Margarete looked at the ring, at Thomas's hopeful face, at the future he was offering. She thought about her mother and sister in Germany, about the guilt she would carry for choosing her own happiness over their immediate needs. But she also thought about the woman she had become, about the chance for redemption and rebuilding that America represented. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry me." They married on June 22, 1946, at 15, in a small ceremony at the Hendersons' church. The guest list was small: a few friends from Camp Crossville, the Henderson family, and Thomas's youngest sister, who had defied their parents to attend. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding Margarete had once imagined as a girl in Munich, but it was honest and real. The years that followed brought challenges. Thomas's family slowly accepted Margarete, won over by her quiet dignity and obvious devotion to their son. The couple settled in Tennessee, where Margarete found work as a translator on August 5, 1946, and Thomas managed a small farm. They had 3 children: Elizabeth, born March 14, 1948, Robert, born November 7, 1950, and Sarah, born June 2, 1953. The children grew up bilingual, equally comfortable with schnitzel and fried chicken. 20 years later, on September 23, 1965, at 10, Margarete stood before an audience at a military wives' conference in Washington, D.C., invited to speak about her extraordinary journey from enemy prisoner to American military spouse. She was 44 now, her dark blonde hair showing streaks of gray, but her green eyes still sharp and intelligent. "People ask me how I could fall in love with my captor," she began. "But that misunderstands what happened. I didn't fall in love with a guard or a captor. I fell in love with a man who saw past my uniform and my nationality to recognize my humanity. Thomas didn't offer me freedom. I was freed by military order on March 1, 1946. What he offered me was something far more valuable. He offered me the possibility of becoming someone new." She paused, scanning the audience of military wives, many of whom had their own complicated stories of wartime romance. "Our story isn't really about love conquering all or enemies becoming friends," though those things did happen. It's about what happens when we choose to see people as individuals rather than symbols. When we remember that behind every uniform, every nationality, every historical narrative, there are human beings making difficult choices with imperfect information. Margarete's transformation from German prisoner to American citizen had influenced immigration policies for war brides and displaced persons. Her marriage to Thomas had helped pave the way for hundreds of other German women who married American soldiers in the post-war years. Their success demonstrated that former enemies could build genuine partnerships. Today, their grandchildren carry both German and American heritage, embodying the reconciliation that their grandparents chose against all odds. The story of the German women who fell in love with their guards reminds us that even in the rigid hierarchies of military captivity, human connection finds a way. That love, when genuine and freely chosen, can bridge the deepest divides, and that sometimes the bravest choice is to risk everything for a chance at happiness that seems impossible. As Margarete concluded her speech that day at 11:30, she said something that would be quoted in military training manuals for decades. "They were so kind to me when they had every reason not to be. That kindness changed everything. It showed me that who I had been didn't have to determine who I would become. And in the end, isn't that what America is supposed to offer everyone, the chance to write a new story?"